Hello and welcome again to Straight Talk. This is part two of a two-part program on property rights. And I have sitting with me here today as my guest Hal Shurtleff of Camp Constitution and Lynn Edmonds of Wallingford, a very interested citizen working with his planning commission and various other groups to engender some interest in property rights and the assault on them. Welcome to the program again, Hal. It's good to have you here. Lynn?
Thanks.
Great to be here with you. For the viewers, I really want you to focus in on what this means to you as a property owner. Now, we in this country have devoted pretty much our entire history to individual rights and freedoms. They're enshrined in the Constitution, which is why Hal's lifetime effort of Camp Constitution is so important, not only to him, but to the people that he serves, the families that he serves, and all across the world through his podcast, through his YouTube, through his radio program. Maybe you don't see it as an assault on your individual rights, but every single time any government entity puts another restriction on your property that you've worked a lifetime to be able to enjoy, and basically takes your voice away from you in terms of your protesting these assaults on your property rights, that should give you enough concern that you would really hone in on what you can do. Because if you sit back and say you're going to let somebody else do it, or you sit back and you say, well, this is too big an issue for me, I can't tackle this individually, I can tell you from my past experience that you're wrong. You are important as an individual. You're just as important as any other individual that you're dealing with. And my gentle instruction to you is to get involved. And if you get involved, you will find out not only what's going on, but you'll find out what you can do and what contributions you can make as an individual to the discussion. And that's all it is, a discussion, a rational discussion. If you don't have a rational discussion on these subjects, then you will get what you're given, and that may not be what you want. So I guess what I want to do today in this follow-up program is hone in on those specifics, and I'll go to you, Hal, and ask you what works in terms of personal involvement.
Well, that's a good question. Before I do that, let me just address the idea of private property. Even if you don't own a home or a farm, you use private property. You rent private property. All the goods and services that you utilize are the results of something coming off private property. So it's an issue that's important for everybody, and maybe someday you will own property, private property. But you ask, well, how do you get involved? Now, I'll give you some anecdotal things that were phenomenal. Little town of Ringe, New Hampshire. It's about, 3 hours from here, south. It's in the southwest corner of New Hampshire. This is where our camp used to be. So I was in town. I think it was in March of 2012. And I left some information off to the selectmen in the town. They have 3. So I do recommend that if you don't know your selectmen, get to know them, because those are the people that are making decisions for your local town, or in some cases. And it was on Agenda 21. But what happened is I went down on the table a little bit like this. There was a printout. It was called the Ringe Charrette. Now, I knew what a charrette was. It was a visionary session, and they just changed the term because the name of visionary session became controversial. So as they took Gary Lauren's advice to change it, you think of a charrette, you think of a couple of French people sitting around drinking wine and eating cheese while wearing berets, but it was nothing more than a visionary session. And I got a copy of that, and I read it, and I said, this is Agenda 21 coming into Ringe. And I utilized the local editor to the newspaper, letters to the editor. In this case, it was a Monadnock Ledger. And I wrote a 3 or 4 paragraph letter, and I submitted it to the newspaper. And then I used social media, Facebook, and most towns have a Facebook page. And I posted the letter on the Town of Ringe Facebook page. Well, within a couple of days, a couple of hours, some of the green activists, maybe I call them, and all these people came from out of town too. None of them were indigenous to Ringe. And they vilified me. They said I was working for the Koch brothers, that I was an out-of-stater, an out-of-towner. And of course, I did have ancestors from Ringe, so that helped me a little bit. But some of the other folks in town that weren't too happy about these other folks said, hey, there's something to this. We don't know much about it. And one particular man got a hold of me in person, and we met. And I said, you need to learn a little bit about this so you don't have to be a walking encyclopedia, but just get some of the facts and figures. And he spent, a couple of months. He just kind of jumped right in and learned a lot about it. And I recommended they host a meeting in the town, and they did. And this would be at the fall of that same year. We had about 250 people, almost everybody from the town of Ringe. And that's a lot of people coming out. And they had a few state representatives that had similar problems, and they successfully fought it. And then the March election, they had, I don't know if they used the term warrant articles here in Vermont, but they had some questions on the ballot, referendum questions, they call them warrant articles. One of them was to take the charrette off of the master plan. The other one was that anytime HUD money comes into town, housing and urban development, there'd have to be a general election before the money would be accepted. Because money can do a lot of damage. It can do a lot of good, but it can do a lot of damage. And then there was a few other things they put on there. And they all passed by like a 3 to 4 to 1 margin. It was amazing. Also, 2 of the selectmen were replaced by pro-liberty selectmen. The town manager resigned and moved out of town. So, and in the wake of that, an organization called Save Our Town came about, where in the past, if it was a planning commission meeting or a select meeting, only the people were the local green activists. All the other folks staying at home, they're too busy making a living, working 2 jobs, or going fishing, or camping, or what have you. Now, and they don't have to have 50 people to meet, you have 2 or 3 there. And so some of the things they wanted to push, they can't. And not only, it's not just the environmental stuff, but it's also tax issues too, school committees. So now you've got a vibrant group that's watchdog, and that's what we should always have. We used to have a media that was a watchdog, and in some cases we see that, and I see some media here, and I think that's great. But a lot of times, I've had media people come up to me and say, we've never heard of this Agenda 21. We don't know anything about this group called ICLEI, the ICLEI. I said, because you're not investigating. When the city does something, the town does something, you're there to be a watchdog. And so that's what I recommend. Also, the town of Carver, Massachusetts, which is cranberry country, and my ancestors settled Carver, and there's a shirtlift park. And it was kind of funny because we had a lady that got really active, involved, and she hosted a meeting, and we had over 100 people. And there was, and there was some media there. And in the wake of that, the town removed itself from this UN subdivision called the ICLEI.
So that was success.
Oh, big success, yeah.
Well, you mentioned the media, and I don't want to miss this opportunity to thank the media that's here watching our program in the studio today. The Rutland Herald is here, and also True North is here, and that should be covered, and you might see it in your local publications, and we want to thank them. I also want to thank Dave Suya once again and the Vermont Good Neighbor Project for sponsoring this program and sponsoring your visit here. And just to lead in and follow up on some of the things that you said, Hal, about success, I'll give you a small example of the success in my town, in Rutland Town, because we just recently dealt with a very similar issue in terms of the Route 4 4-lane highway restructuring program that was brought down through the Regional Commission by the State Agency of Transportation. Of course, they said it wasn't their plan, but everybody knew that it was their plan to take 2 of those 4 lanes away from that highway and do a bicycle pedestrian path, which wasn't necessary to get the bicycle pedestrian path, because there were, in addition to those 4 lanes, there were 2 8-foot wide shoulders that were paved, which had more than enough room for bicycle and but it was part of the calming effect, so they said. It was a calming effect that we wanted to produce. Well, these are words that come out of Agenda 21, and I just want...
Complete streets is one of the terms, complete streets.
Complete Streets program, that's another key red flag term. And I want the viewing public to understand that this stuff did not crop up from individual small town citizen input. This stuff came directly from Agenda 21 and Agenda 30, which is the implementation of Agenda 21 and the 17 goals, which may have nice, sweet-sounding terms and terms that are very endearing to most people because they're benign and they're positive. It's the implementation of them and what has to be done. And at every single case, when you read this, if you want to go on, I'm not a great believer in Wikipedia because search engines can be as ideological as anything else, and they are. And Wikipedia is not a favorable conservative type of a research engine, but it does give an explanation. And for any intelligent person, you can read between the lines, and if you can see red flags in the Wikipedia definitions, then you can well imagine what there'd be if it were written from another ideological point of view. And even under Wikipedia's definitions, at every single point where it comes to implementation of Agenda 21 and Agenda 30, it is the developed countries that are looked at for the economic foundation for all of this. So in other words, it's our money. So if you look at it in terms of Vermont, you should be thinking of what did Act 6068 do to the educational system? It did exactly what Agenda 21 and 30 want to do to the whole world economy. It takes from the rich and gives to the poor. For what goals? Well, we don't know what the goals were because they haven't been met. It was a great ideological plan in Vermont to say we want to provide an equal educational opportunity. Now that's a nice thing. Nobody is going to argue against that. But how do you do it? You take away from those communities in the state that had the most entrepreneurialism, that had the most economic development, that had the most industrial development, that were the most successful because they did things right, obviously. Some of them just happened to be in the right place, like Vernon with a nuclear plant. But the others did many, many good things, including tax stabilization, to bring the economy up. What did the state do? They penalized them by taking that money away from them and giving them to other communities. Which communities? The big communities that had a whole mess of social needs. So it's rob from the rich and give to the poor. That's what agenda.
Rob from the middle class.
Well, that too. But my point to the public is, if you look at the United Nations as a whole, when have you ever seen anything that the United Nations did that we would want to adopt in our country? They wanted diversity, they pumped diversity, and look at what Brexit has done. Look what's happening throughout the whole of Europe with the diversity program. It's in a shambles. Look at what's happening in France with the Paris Accords. There's riots in the streets. Look at Venezuela, what's happened in that socialist country. Riots in the streets. People can't afford to feed themselves. We know that socialism doesn't work, and we know that the United Nations is pushing socialism over capitalism. And it's not anything more than plain logic. When would the United States create a template for the one country that has broken away and become economically successful, democratically successful, the most democratic and free country in the world? And it used to be that it was enough for us to give of our wealth to the developing countries, to the third world countries, which we have given freely and greatly. But that's not enough anymore. Now we need to transfer not only the wealth, but the people from the rest of the world into the United States. That's what the refugee program is about. That's what the immigrant program is about. We need to replace the US citizens. And at the same time, we're replacing citizens, we need to cut down on the number of American citizens, which is population growth. So we fought this in the town of Rutland, and we got the 4-lane decision taken away. And that was the long explanation of the short term. We won on that issue. What successes have you had in Wallingford with your program, Lynn?
Well, we've had some success, I think, in getting people to realize that you know, there are things that are affecting their property rights, and I think people get excited about property rights, especially if they're old enough, or you know, in my case, when they're about retired, and the thing that I worry about, though, is the younger generation that's coming up that doesn't understand these basic principles of our success the way we do, and I don't believe they're necessarily being taught as much anymore, and we kind of take things for granted. I kind of think that we split up into groups or collectives, and we pay way too much attention to issues and details of issues, and that becomes a distraction from the way our country was founded and the way it was intended to work, and what ultimately became our success was following these basic principles. I view capitalism as being what creates the incentive we need to feed the engine of capitalism. And capitalism being our vehicle of economics. Without it, we can't propel that vehicle, we can't prosper. I think 50 years ago, when Vermont started down this road of Act 250 and alike, and planning, essentially turning the state into somewhat of a central planning organization, I think we became a hybrid at that point. And going forward, I think right now we're probably riding in a vehicle of economics that is a hybrid, in fact. And the problem with that is, at some point, when the capitalist segment of that vehicle can no longer support the socialist segment, because socialism generally distributes wealth. It doesn't create wealth. And at some point, when capitalism can no longer be a host that sustains it, then we're going to all be in a big mess here. And I think that's something that we need to be very concerned about, because we can't sustain, and while this is happening, you know, socialism probably has a very big smile on its face while it's a hybrid vehicle. But once you take that element of capitalism away, that smile is going to turn to a frown very quickly. And that's when you're going to see the rationing of benevolent outcomes to people. And I don't think that's when it gets like Venezuela and places like that are experiencing the difficulties. I think we need to get back more to basics, stop talking about issues all the time. We have to, especially our legislators, have to start looking at issues from the standpoint of how do they impact on capitalism and our free market system. And I think if we do that, I was struck when we came back. We moved away to South Carolina for 2 years to get to know our grandchildren. And we moved back because we really missed Vermont, and we just weren't suited to that climate, and so on and so forth. But when I came back, while we were down there, Hurricane Irene started up the coast. And so I went out and bought a generator and put it in the garage, and the storm never hit. It turned, and as you know, it came to Vermont and hit pretty badly. So we came back to Vermont. I never used a generator. I got back here and I'd start it once a year. But what I noticed when we came back was all these Vermont Strong license plates. And I look back over the last 50 years, and I don't think, to me, Vermont is all that strong. We're spending an awful lot of time planning, but we're not spending time doing anything that's constructive sometimes, I think. So I just don't think that we can continue down that road much longer and sustain the state. I think if we weren't looking, Agenda 21 is not as much of a conspiracy as it is that we aren't recognizing how we got where we are.
It's a lack of education.
It's a lack
the
of
people.
education, it's a lack of understanding. If we applied the knowledge we have to that understanding, we wouldn't allow a lot of the stuff that happens.
Now, you've had some successes, have you, in opening
We
people's
have,
eyes?
I mean, we've obtained the Australian ballot, and I think that's critical because your regional planning doesn't allow for the people to protect their property rights. And that seems like a small thing, but it isn't, because it reminds people that property rights are important. It shouldn't be something, it should be something that's dealt with as a direct democracy, not as a representative democracy.
No,
Those are rights.
Well, you've developed this on your own, didn't you? This Vermont Strong?
No, that's just something, that was just some homework that I did.
Some homework?
Yeah.
Well,
No,
no, but these are-
but those are
these
points, the point is that,
Where do these points come from? Because they're really good points.
well, they're points that, thinking about this stuff, and it's hard to sift and sort through it sometimes, but try to break it down so that you can communicate it. That's the biggest frustration for me, is all this information and trying to explain it to people so they will understand it. And that seemed like a good way because of coming back to Vermont, seeing that Vermont Strong license plate, and then thinking to myself, geez, we're not as strong as we could be if we were
Listen,
doing
this is good. I mean, you gave it to me. I'd like to give it to the people, and because it's good. And then I'll let you finish up, Hal.
Sure.
Vermont Strong, what does it mean to be Vermont Strong? Vermont Strong is when the people protect individual property rights by their direct vote. Vermont Strong is when people are placed above and before the lobbyist. Vermont Strong is when the future is developed in the free market, not by government subsidy. Vermont Strong is when people recognize what kills capitalism. Vermont Strong is when we understand prosperity is created by protecting property rights. Vermont Strong is when we realize winning elections is irrelevant. Vermont Strong is when individuals understand their rights are more important than a political party. Vermont Strong is when we are not distracted by issues and hold fast to our founding principles. Vermont Strong is when we realize we do not need regional planning commissions. Vermont Strong is when we understand grants are not always free or necessary. Vermont Strong is when it's common knowledge that most programs create the need for more programs. Vermont Strong is when we realize Act 250 was not the idea of the people of Vermont. Vermont Strong is when we realize those that created the problem can always make it worse. Vermont Strong is when we realize 50 years of Act 250 looks better than revisiting it. Vermont Strong is free market capitalism. Vermont Strong is honest work without manipulation. Vermont Strong knows protecting individual property rights creates incentive to produce prosperity. Vermont Strong knows what works and remembers how to duplicate it. Vermont Strong does not excuse responsibility or obligation to be productive. Vermont Strong is understanding how property rights propel the engine of capitalism. Vermont Strong is sustainable property rights. Vermont Strong is creating an actual product, not economic development. Vermont Strong understands socialism does not produce, it consumes. And Vermont Strong understands we must produce to sustain.
Very
And
good.
there you go, Hal. It's yours to
Well,
wrap up this
one of the
program.
things I want to say is that our founders gave us a Republican form of government, nothing to do with a party. And Vermont was known at one time, before it became it was a separate country before it became part of the United States, the Republic of Vermont. It's the rule of law, res publica, the public thing, in this case the law. So the whims of the majority cannot take the rights of the minority away. And when I'm speaking of minority, I'm not necessarily speaking of a different ethnic group, but those who may have a minority opinion. I live in Boston. My view is the minority view by a large margin. But I still have rights, or should have rights. So that shouldn't matter. That's because we are a republic. And I love the term free market. free market, because the word capitalism, because that gets into, well, you're a capitalist, and you have this notion that if you're a capitalist, you're uncaring, unfeeling, and it's most of the large companies that create the jobs. They're the ones that donate to the charities. I mean, it's amazing. But free market is what made this the greatest country in the history of the world, in my opinion. And we need to keep those free markets. And I like when you mentioned foreign aid. I can't remember where I heard it, but I heard a great definition is when you take money from poor people in rich countries and give it to rich people in poor countries. When you take foreign aid, government money, it goes to governments. But you have a lot of charitable organizations, Doctors Without Borders, for example. You know, that's a French-based Médecins Sans Frontières. My high school French isn't so good. They don't care what party you belong to. They go in there and do some help. You got groups like the Red Cross. You've got a lot of farm aid groups that go right to the people themselves. I have a friend who is one of our instructors. He's from the South Sudan. He has a ministry that goes to the South Sudan and meets the needs. He doesn't go to the government of the Sudan, although he is on good terms with them. So that's the solution here. You also mentioned education. I tell you that today in every single school in Vermont and in Massachusetts and around the country, the students are being inundated with the fear of imminent climate change. We're all going to die in a few years. That should stop. I remember when I was in the 70s, when I was in junior high, it was climate cooling that was going to, we were going to have a perpetual winter, and that scared us. And one of the things that came out of the United Nations was this thing called Rescue Mission Planet Earth, a child's guide to Agenda 21. See, back then they could say Agenda 21 the first few years. And this is the most blatant propaganda I've ever seen. It has children, 10-year-old, is asking their pregnant mommy they should have an abortion because we have too many people in the world, and every time a child is born, Mother Earth groans. This is and Mikhail Gorbachev and Al Gore signed off on this thing, right? Mikhail Gorbachev was dropping booby traps on little booby trap toys to kill little children in Afghanistan or blow their faces up, you see. So what I encourage people, even if you disagree or say, oh, these guys are, check out the facts. We have a website, campconstitution.net. You can get this as a free download. You can go to our YouTube channel. We have a playlist on Agenda 21 and on climate change. You're hearing things sometimes for the first time. And also, I'm also affiliated with the American Policy Center, led by Mr. Tom DeWeese, who's probably one of the nation's experts, top experts. He travels all over the time. And it's the AmericanPolicyCenter.org, and you can get a lot of information about that. So even if you might be watching this and you're angry and I've never heard this and these guys must be the tools of the Koch brothers, whom, by the way, I do not like. They're for open borders. Just do some research. That's all. That's all we ask. Check it out, and if you like what you see, please, contact us.
Great. I'll tell you what. I don't know whether you as viewers think this was a great program, but as a host, I can guarantee you, to me, it was a great program. And I learned as much as I could and as much as I would, and a lot more than I knew before I started this program. And I want to thank you, Hal, and I want to thank you, Lynn, for your efforts locally. This is not the last time that you'll hear about this. I encourage you to follow your legislature very carefully. Follow these changes to Act 250 because they are crucial and they are key to the property rights argument that's taking place in this state. And you must see these as affronts against your individual rights and do something about it. Thank you again. This has been Straight Talk with Don Chioffi. We'll see you next time.